this war, that you can be for or against it, but it's obviously a war that's in Europe, so therefore it's not that surprising that it will be quite interesting to European countries who are taking millions of refugees from, and maybe for that reason it is more impactful on them than the war in Afghanistan or in Libya, which is further away and which generates less direct implications. For that reason, no doubt, if you live in Africa, a conflict in the DRC is going to be more interesting.
The DRC doesn't become global news day in and day out, and a conflict in the DRC doesn't have the United States and Europeans saying, which side are you on? So, for instance, China and India have decided that they are not going to take sides. You will know that the Europeans and the Americans have used that to target China and say it's essentially supporting Russia. The Chinese do not want to get involved. This is not their war. The Indians, for the first time, have taken a position which is similar to the Chinese and came under a huge amount of criticism from the Europeans and the Americans for not taking sides. So when the Europeans and the Americans say the international community, that's misleading, that's a lie. The international community, of course, sympathize with the tragedy that's going on. But they know that this is not as simple as just the Russians invaded Ukraine and these are good guys and bad guys. We know from our history of colonization that essentially the West has played the same old game of divide and rule. And last week only we had Joe Biden here essentially claiming that the Americans would essentially go to war on behalf of Taiwan. Extremely irresponsible statements at a time when the world is essentially in such great conflict.
Can you talk a bit about what this post-Western world would look like then?
Well, a post-Western world will look like one in which we do not have essentially everything that is seen as laying the rules down as being led by the Western world. We will not have a world in which Europe and the United States are petrified by the rise of another power called China. A post-Western world will look like one in which, when the rankings in the FT about the best business schools in the world are made, they're not all Western business schools. A post-Western world will look like in which the IMF chief, whether it's a woman or not, is not a European. It's a person of a substance who is the best to do that world. A post-Western world in the sports arena will look like one in which the 35 or 36 international sporting organizations are not essentially all domiciled in Europe, except for one. I'm not sure if you're aware of that. So a post-Western world is one in which there will be a lot more sort of diversity of media views, and views from other parts of the world are not dismissed as coming from undemocratic systems. A post-Western world will also look like one in which we have plurality of political systems, and just because it doesn't align with the Western democratic system as defined by the West doesn't mean it's illegitimate. So that's what I think a post-Western world would look like, and there are many ways to expand on that list.
And what would geopolitics look like then? I mean, how would you have a more fragmented world with institutions like the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank sitting alongside Western ones? Would it be divided into kind of Western, non-Western things, or would you have? I mean, would you go for universal institution? What's your kind of vision for how the world should be run?
That's a good one. So a post-Western world does not need to be a fragmented one. In the Western world, anything that essentially arises from other parts of the world, which are in competition with it, are seen to be somehow eroding the rules-based order. To have the AIIB is not to fragment the system. The World Bank is essentially an American institution. It's run by the West. Its president is always an American. So the post-Western world will be one in which I said plurality of organizations, institutions, more international competition, less fearfulness of the established institutions to embrace others. We could have an international Arab bank with the money that they have to spend in different parts of the world. So it would be one in which the institutions themselves are not dominated by the West, and it would be ones in which the West cannot continue to decide who are the good and bad guys and impose sanctions using the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which then the Europeans all support to punish anyone that is seen as essentially not an ally of the West. We will have perhaps different rules by which the grand bargain, which was the Bretton Woods arrangement, is not now weaponized by essentially one nation and its allies to essentially thwart anyone else that has a different position. So it's a lot more diverse, not fragmented, cooperative, but not run by essentially the tyranny of a small group of nations.
What do you think, because we're a European think tank working on European foreign policy, what do you think Europe needs to do in order to manage its decline and to create space for the rest of the world? How can Europeans be allies in dismantling global white privilege? Should they be, or is this going to happen anyway as other people fight for their rights?
I mean, the first thing I'd say is no one wants to see a decline of Europe in terms of the ability of the European civilization, cultures and societies, and Americans to contribute to a better world. What I am talking about dismantling is not about decline. It's essentially self-help. The Europeans, in my view, particularly to your point about think tanks, I think are too tethered to the American way of thinking. So few Europeans are willing to speak up against the American hegemony. So yes, you are right that when the Iraq War was conducted, etc., Germany and France opted out, etc. But there remain strong alliances with the Americans. So I, for one, have never understood, and I've lived in Europe for 7-8 years, never understood why the Europeans, I sort of understand Second World War and all of that, but I never understood why, despite the bad behavior, the wars, the military sort of overreach of the Americans, the Europeans felt somehow they had to support them. And I think the real important thing for think tanks in Europe is to start to carve out their own thoughts and foreign policy. And I've argued that part of the mistake, in my view, of what's happened in Europe at the moment with Ukraine is the Europeans outsource their security to the Americans and NATO, and this happened. And therefore, you can say a belligerent Putin acted in the way he thought he needed to, in his imagination, about the aggression of NATO. He didn't have any adult in the room in Europe to speak to, and coincidentally, I'm always thinking, it happened 3 months after Angela Merkel left. So think tanks in Europe, I think, should reach out to Asia, reach out to Africa, and start to carve out a niche that is quite independent of the American foreign policy and its think tanks, which are so subservient to essentially the patriotic sort of discourse in the United States. Independence would be a good thing in Europe for think tanks.